Pretty good episode, but I feel like something's missing from it. Hello, everyone. I thought I'd do something a little bit different today. I do have some new dub ideas in the works, but for now, I wanted to share a project of mine that's been on the back burner for some time. Part of a new series where I talk about various what-if or AU concepts for existing media. Starting with one that has a simple enough premise, but one with massive potential for ripple effects, as I've come to find out. It started out simple enough. A longtime friend of mine by the name of Megatronsky, check them out on Twitter below, offhandedly mentioned the idea of TFA Megatron getting a Headmaster unit body and going on a body-stealing rampage as, a joke. But then we stopped and actually thought about it for a second and went, we could work with this. This was not helped by our recent meetup at TFCon LA this past month, and the fact that we celebrated by rewatching the entirety of TFA Season 1 on the first day. And how we noticed that Megatron was suspiciously absent from the Headmaster episode, which has led me to assume that Isaac just didn't tell him. I wouldn't put it past him to somehow forget to mention to Megatron, such revolutionary human-made transforming drones with body hijacking capabilities. Nothing of use to the sentient guy stuck as a head in my basement for the last 50 years. With that in mind, let's set the scene sometime after the Headmaster incident is cleared up. Isaac returns to his lab in a huff, and I imagine in the original timeline, the poor dude went straight to bed after 2, maybe 3 days dealing with that fucking basement dweller of a former employee he has. But for the sake of this setting, we'll just say he was a little bit too high-strung to go to bed right away and needed to do some tinkering to ease his mind. Megatron, having also apparently slept through the events of Headmaster, takes notice of Isaac returning to the lab and his less than pleasant demeanor. With a bit of coaxing from Megatron, probably asking sarcastically at that, Isaac proceeds to vent to his so-called friend about Masterson's exploits. Megatron, goes through the motions, feigns sympathy, maybe taking a quick moment to make a subtle jab at Starscream, saying something about how he understands what it's like to deal with, overzealous employees. Once mention is made of the barbaric Headmaster units, however, and how they function as tiny, transforming robots that convert into, head modules capable of hijacking even Cybertronian frames, Megatron starts to get a little bit more interested. Tuning out Isaac's rant entirely by this point, Megatron considers the potential of such technology, namely in service of giving him a more independent physical form again. It may not be ideal for him to be stuck in such a small body, relatively speaking, but Megatron can at least reason that a partial restoration of his autonomy would be worth a slight sacrifice in dignity. It's at this point where Megatron interrupts Isaac mid-speech and inquires about the status of these Headmaster modules. Isaac confirms that Masterson escaped, but admits that he and Fanzone discovered 2 more at the scene of Masterson's lab while searching for Bulkhead's body. Because that was a thing if you haven't seen the episode in a while. There were 2 more Headmaster units, presumably fully functional, and nothing came of it. It's at this point that Megatron suggests that, logically, Isaac should acquire one of those spare modules and, maybe incorporate its technology into a more compact frame for Megatron himself. Isaac is hesitant about this, of course, reiterating his disgust at the concept of creating weapons for any reason, especially something as sadistic as a Headmaster unit. This is where Megatron takes the opportunity to lay it on thick, that, by all accounts, Isaac does owe him for the innovations he was able to bring to humanity off of Megatron's back. So to speak. Further adding that it would be prudent to reverse engineer the technology, but not as a tool of war or anything, no. Instead, Megatron would construe it as Isaac studying what makes the units tick, and, take preventative measures in the event that hardwired head case decides to come back, or to help prevent other tech-savvy terrorists that come out of the woodworks. I mean, by this point there has been a decent number of them. Most of them made by Megatron, but he's obviously not going to mention that part. Megatron's persuasion and not-so-subtle guilt-tripping are enough to win Isaac over on the matter, as he's able to have someone retrieve one of Masterson's spare units from the police lockup. So, not only will Isaac have an understanding of how Megatron's body works and how to counteract certain elements, the same will be true of the Headmaster units going forwards. So, Henry's gonna have a bad time when he shows his Spencer's looking ass up again in this AU. And so begins one of many sleepless nights, with Isaac taking apart the Headmaster unit and including Megatron's components into it piece by piece. The end result being slightly larger than the original units to facilitate Megatron's larger head and the intricate components associated with it. Though much smaller and less intimidating than either of his original timeline forms, Megatron's humanoid form in this setting is still a decent bit larger than Bumblebee and Prowl, ensuring that he's a decent physical presence against most Autobots. I mean, it's not super dignified, it's still, manlet Megatron, but hey, you gotta have some dignity. In head mode, Megatron has opted for an almost perfect recreation of the one utilized for his original Cybertronian body, though cast in black is sort of a nod to older concepts of the character with a black helmet. The reason Megatron goes for an upgraded variant of his Cybertronian helmet as opposed to something more akin to his Earth design in the final concept, well, that'll be more apparent as we get to not Nature Calls, because there really isn't much divergence material there. Assuming the events of Headmaster and Nature Calls take place maybe a few months apart, being generous, Megatron is probably just hanging out in Isaac's lab, getting the hang of his new body while Isaac goes out and reclaims the old one. Where it does get juicy is, of course, the events of Megatron Rising. Most of the setup is the same, the important difference being that Megatron is able to assist in the restoration of his old frame through his own bare hands. Well, so to speak. Progress is also helped by the fact that Megatron still has remote access to some DAC machinery that he can control in unison with his own body. Meaning, opposed to the patchy but still impressive job in the main timeline, Megatron's body is almost completely intact and ready to go again. However, issues with the generators running Sundeck Tower remain present, and in a way worse because of the additional strain from Megatron tapping into it himself. All those extra arms can't exactly run off of nothing, Megatron just barely manages to cover up for himself with Isaac as he grows even more frustrated this time, seeing how much closer they were able to get in the same amount of time. Isaac still leaves Megatron to his devices to go and try to repair the generators after Sari fails to do so herself with the key, setting in motion the same basic events of the main timeline. Though it would be deeply amusing to see manlet Megatron go out and try to grab the key for himself in some kind of a Pink Panther situation or whatever, I don't see Megatron getting his hands dirty or making himself known in such a diminutive state. He still reaches out to Lugnut and inadvertently sends Starscream his way while he tries to proceed with repairs in the meantime. I'm actually torn as to whether or not Megatron would make a point to transform back into head mode when Starscream arrives, or remain in his new robot mode. I do enjoy the mental image of Starscream being too preoccupied trying not to giggle at tiny Megatron in the event that he catches him in Headmaster mode though. But for the sake of the story, and not detracting from the reveal later, I feel like it'd be better if Megatron pretended he was still just a severed head, lull Starscream into a false sense of security and all that. Part 1's events mostly carry out the same way as it did in the original timeline, up to the point of Lugnut and Blitzwing arriving with Sari's key after Megatron gets a little bit of comeuppance. Only difference here being that Megatron does finally transform into his Headmaster mode in front of the other Decepticons, prompting Blitzwing's various personalities to take turns commenting on it, and Lugnut to overcompensate and speak to his greatness and how no mere physical form can hinder the majestic spirit of Megatron, or something like that, I don't know. Megatron says something to the effect of, "That may be true, but one must keep up appearances. Let those who dare deny me the Allspark witness its true power-given form." He leaps towards his Cybertronian body and stands atop its shoulders, sticking the key into his chest seconds before linking up with his original body for the first time in centuries, absorbing a decent amount of nearby materials and his waiting right arm into a veil of bluish-white light. Much the same as the original storyline, Megatron erupts from the ceiling of Sundeck Tower and makes his presence known. This being where a major deviation occurs. See, whereas I figured the key had to do more to compensate for the absolute sorry state Megatron's body was in originally, Megatron's assistance was able to streamline the process even in spite of interruptions and power failure. With less work to do, the key doesn't provide as drastic an upgrade to Megatron this time, instead giving him a body very similar to his original form. While somewhat shorter and less powerful than Megatron's Earth mode upgrade in the original, this ROTF-inspired body is still significantly larger than the Autobots, and compensates by being more versatile. Instead of his individual swords, Megatron boasts a new built-in cannon with a brutal retractable bayonet at the end of it. Likewise, as something of a loophole to the whole triple changing makes you crazy idea in TFA, Megatron's new alternate mode would probably be some kind of Cybertronian tank with a flight mode, as another nod to Revenge of the Fallen. His first form in this one are progressive references to his designs in the live-action movies. I wonder if that's gonna be a thing in this AU. Being somewhat less powerful means that Megatron can't quite bowl through as many of Prowl, Optimus, and Bulkhead's attacks, but he does still thoroughly wipe the floor with them regardless, make no mistake. Best any of them can manage is a minor scuff on his new frame. A far cry from what they were even capable of in just the series opener. Okay, this one is another aspect I'm kind of torn on about how it should play out, also pertaining to Starscream. If you guys like this video, I would really appreciate your comments on this part, or really anything that stuck with you, but Megatron takes out the Autobots and calls for his loyal Decepticons as it is in the original two-parter, complete with Starscream playing dumb and setting in motion Megatron's revenge. But here are two compelling options, I think, that I'd like you guys to weigh in on in the comments. Route 1. Megatron still kills Starscream, but in a much more brutal and personal fashion. The key isn't wasted on someone like Starscream here. Not after what he pulled. No! Megatron instead has something akin to Revenge of the Fallen Optimus' fate, where he whips around and fully extends his bayonet right through the Seeker's chest, hoisting the writhing bot, kicking and screaming a few feet off the ground before blasting him square through the spark, letting him fall gray and, thoroughly ventilated on the street below. May sound a little bit too vicious for TFA, some of you might be thinking, but considering they got away with Megatron blasting his torso into bits later in the show anyway, I feel like this could work. It would also add a neat visual component to Starscream in this AU, I think, where this time he would be sporting a massive hole through his chest for as long as he has the Allspark shard in his head. However, there is another very compelling idea courtesy of a friend and frequent enabler, Agatha Wrights, who also provided visualization for this option. While the idea to kill Starscream is so tempting to Megatron in the moment, he could instead opt for a more ironic punishment to really drive home the 50 stellar cycles of helplessness and humiliation line. He could do this by briefly detaching from his new body and using his upgraded Headmaster systems to lop off Starscream's head and punt it into the river. Or maybe a garbage barge if he's lucky. That way Starscream is still taken out of the picture, but things are set up to be a little bit more unique. With Megatron sporting a backup body, just in case, Either way, he ends up getting the point across to his Decepticons and gives the Autobots a chance to retreat and lick their wounds, setting up once again for familiar beats until another major shift during his and Optimus' last fight of the season. One-on-one, Megatron is still a far more formidable and capable threat against Optimus, meaning that the affair is still fairly one-sided towards Megatron's favor, with him countering Prime's more clever tricks with raw firepower and demonstrations of his alt modes. Perhaps even extending to a moment where Megatron gives Optimus the old Green Goblin treatment and rams into him in hover tank mode. Busting up his grills. However, with a much more similar body to the one that Isaac used to help build his empire, the makeshift prod Isaac had would probably do a lot more damage in this setting, briefly disrupting critical components that allow Megatron to transform. This would buy Optimus and Sorry the time they need to set up Megatron for a more disastrous fall in this timeline. Megatron is, of course, still alive, but much more extensively damaged because of Isaac and his less sturdy upgrade. His transformation mechanisms are completely disrupted by the blast, and he probably sports a missing arm and a damaged face. Not unlike his film counterpart after a rough run-in with Optimus. Megatron is furious that he's essentially sent back to square one, right back to having a damaged, less dignified form, and seemingly no means of acquiring the Allspark now. But he does still have Isaac as a consolation prize, swearing to make sure that Isaac assists him in future endeavors, setting up the events of Season 2, mostly as usual. So that's the basic rundown of how this AU kicks off, and the few but drastic changes it has on the last few episodes of Season 1. Guess this is what happens when you overthink the one episode where Megatron was just sleeping through the whole ordeal, I guess. There wasn't very much to cover with this one, but I wanted to share it with you guys regardless, and set up the groundwork for a potential follow-up pertaining to Season 2's events in this version of the story. because that's where a lot of the really drastic differences rear their heads. New Allspark creations coming into existence in place of established characters in the original timeline, character growth spurred on by these changes, and who knows, maybe Megatron won't be the only one seeing a drastic makeover. I'd love to know what you all make of this in the comments, or what you and your friends might have to say about certain choices, whether you agree or disagree with me, or if you have other ideas of how this storyline would play out. So please be sure to share the video if you enjoyed it, I would greatly appreciate it. Until then, I hope to see you guys next time, and hope to come back a little bit stronger with some more drastic storyline changes for Season 2. I still don't know how to end videos, bye.